I'm Betta Broad, the campaign director of New Yorkers for Clean Power. I also wear another hat as the director of advocacy and organizing at the Association for Energy Affordability, and have the great pleasure of working with many of you across the state on the transition off of fossil fuels to clean energy and clean transportation and taking action on climate. So great to see you, and really excited about our event today, where we're going to be learning about the latest with the transportation sector in New York State, what's in New York's draft scoping plan related to transportation, and how we can really drive change in the sector. And of course, continuing to encourage everyone to submit comments on the draft scoping plan. We have Jen Metzger, who has done a ton to prepare our great guide. We can share a link to that. And we have some other transportation experts who we're going to hear from today. Really grateful that you all were able to join us, share what you're working on, and how we can advance the most ambitious scoping plan, climate action plan, and make sure that our transportation goals that are enshrined in that plan end up being as ambitious as possible. So thank you all so much. And please feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye on both, and we'll do Q&A at the end. But you know, if you want to enter them as we're going so you don't forget, that's great too. We want this to be, yes.
Better, I'll keep really a good track. Sorry, I'll keep good track of the comments as well, so that I'll start pulling them off. So that'll help the flow.
Thank you so much. And Ibrahim, do you want to introduce yourself while you're at it? My surprise co-host. It's always
hilarious.
Better here.
My name is Ibrahim Abdul-Mateen. I'm one of the senior fellows, senior Clean Power Fellow with New Yorkers for Clean Power. And I do wear a number of other hats. I'm also the author of a book called Green Dean: What Islam Teaches About Protecting the Planet. And I've worked in the Bloomberg administration and de Blasio administration. I work with any administration as long as they're trying to decarbonize our economy and transform our relationship with the planet and the earth. So I'm looking forward to helping move the conversation along and doing some color commentary today, kind of like if I was, you know, like if this is a sporting event, just kind of keeping it punchy a little bit, but also just adding in a little bit of intel from the things that I know and from the spaces, and hopefully asking tough questions if those things come up. But this is a great panel, and this is literally, and I'm glad I get to make this pun, where the rubber meets the road as we talk about decarbonization.
Good one.
I always say that line.
Sorry, I beat you to it, Jen.
So yes, Jen Metzger, who is New Yorkers for Clean Power's senior policy advisor and former state senator, an expert in all things related to transportation, clean energy, ag, serving on the Cannabis Control Board. I mean, what don't you do, Jen? You're amazing, and we so appreciate you giving an overview of the scoping plan process, the transportation sector in particular today, and how we can all take action and submit comments very soon, with the deadline quickly approaching. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Betta. And yeah, it's more like a little about a lot of things, and there is so much to know and learn about climate and its interconnectedness to just about everything in the world. So we're all learning. So hi, everyone. I'm going to set the stage for our discussion today. First, by giving a quick overview of what the scoping plan is and why it's important. For some of you who have been on these scoping plan presentations with me, a few of the initial slides will be a repeat for those who haven't been. I'm also going to talk about where we are in terms of transportation emissions in New York and where we need to be. And then I'll talk about some of the main recommendations of the scoping plan for this sector. We are in an incredibly important moment right now in setting the course to meet the ambitious goals of New York's Climate Act. The draft scoping plan is open for public comment through June 10th, and your input is absolutely critical. And we don't have time to lose. You know, we all saw the news about the Earth's poles experiencing alarming extreme heat in March, 70 degrees warmer than usual in the South Pole. And, you know, closer to home, just last week, Chicago saw temperatures that were higher than Death Valley. And, you know, 3 women living in a senior complex died from that heat. So, you know, this is a critically important moment. You know, we have to steeply reduce greenhouse gas emissions to avoid greatly increasing the harm to us and the planet. But the good news is that we have solutions. And not only that, these solutions will have enormous benefits, you know, beyond the climate benefits for our economy, our health, and our quality of life. So these are changes we want to make for many, many reasons. So I'm going to just share my screen with you all. All righty, and we'll get going. What is the scoping plan? Well, it is the action plan basically to reach the goals of New York's Climate Act. And these include reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 below 1990 levels and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. We're also required to generate 70% of our electricity from renewable resources by 2030 and achieve an entirely fossil fuel-free electricity grid by 2040. And critically, this law is about ensuring a just and equitable transition that prioritizes disadvantaged communities, that leaves nobody behind, and dedicates 35% of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities with the goal of 40%. So the scoping plan is super important because it's going to shape state legislation, state regulation, and the decision-making of every single state agency and department for years to come. It's required to be updated every 5 years, but it is the plan, the action plan of the state government. So the plan was developed by a 22-member Climate Action Council that was established under the climate law. It includes all of the heads of the relevant state departments and agencies, as well as 10 appointed members that include environmental and climate and environmental justice advocates, industry representatives, and scientists primarily. Oh shoot, sorry. What happened here? Hold on 1 second. I lost my screen. Okay. Sorry, guys, you get to see my big screen, but for some reason I lost the slideshow. Okay. So the council's work was informed by the recommendations of 7 advisory panels with expertise in different areas, including a panel on transportation. Both the Climate Justice Working Group and Just Transition Working Group that were created under the law also provided input into this plan. So let's talk about where we are and where we need to be. This pie chart is based on the most up-to-date greenhouse gas emissions inventory for New York. And as you can see, transportation is responsible for the second largest share of emissions, 28%. It's a very close second to buildings. The bar chart shows emissions by subsector and by fuel. As you can see on the bar on the left, cars and light-duty vehicles like SUVs, pickups, vans under 8,500 pounds account for the lion's share of emissions, about 82%. By fuel, gas accounts for by far the largest share, though other fuel types like jet fuel is significant as well. Jet fuel is also is more challenging to replace. So certain trends have exacerbated the impacts of transportation on emissions in New York. Many areas of the state are underserved or unserved altogether by public transportation. Traditional local land use patterns have encouraged sprawl, increasing vehicle miles traveled to work, to the store, to school, etc. And we've also seen huge changes in commerce that have made the delivery of goods much more inefficient. Eliminating emissions from the transportation sector is going to require truly transformative changes. The integration analysis that was undertaken for the scoping plan estimates that we'll need 3 million electric vehicles replacing gas cars on the road by 2030 and 10 million by 2050 in order to stay on target to meet our emissions goals. And just to put it in context, there are about 45,000 fully electric EVs on the road in New York today, so we have a long way to go. We also need to greatly reduce vehicle miles traveled while expanding access to public transportation and also expanding non-motorized alternatives. So how are we going to get there? The scoping plan focuses on 3 overarching strategies: electrification, improvements to public transportation, and smart growth and transit-oriented development and other policies that reduce vehicle miles traveled. All of these strategies provide important benefits beyond the climate benefits, including huge public health and equity benefits. Children's exposure to diesel exhaust inside buses is a serious health and developmental threat that would be entirely eliminated by electrification. Electrifying transportation more widely will eliminate harmful pollutants from tailpipe emissions that are damaging to people's health and that drive up healthcare costs. Disadvantaged communities typically bear the biggest cost of all, since this is where a lot of polluting transportation infrastructure is sited. And expanding public transportation will also greatly increase access by folks, particularly low-income folks, to jobs, educational opportunities, and healthcare. When you live outside of a city and you don't own a car, your opportunities in life are incredibly limited. So I want to mention that while the Climate Action Council was working on the draft plan, some very important actions were taken at the state level. A bill was signed in December of last year into law, requiring that all new sales and leases of cars in New York, they have to be zero emissions by 2035. The law also includes the goal of 100% sales of zero emissions, medium and zero trucks by 2045. Also, around the same time, the DEC finalized the advanced truck rule, setting zero emission standards for sales and leases of medium and heavy duty vehicles through 2035. So I just want to point out that in both cases of the DEC rule and the law, basically New York is now aligned with California's more restrictive regulations. We can't go beyond California's we cannot enact more restrictive regulations than California because of federal preemption rules. And finally, and importantly, this was a huge victory in this year's state budget. It includes legislation requiring all electric school buses by 2035, with all sales of new buses to be electric by 2027. So these are really significant steps that have been taken before the scoping plan has even been finalized. So turning to scoping plan recommendations, a big question is, how do we get people to switch to EVs now, before the 2035 ban on gas sales of new cars takes effect? Because, as I mentioned, the scoping plan estimates that we need 300 million on the road by 2030. So one key scoping plan recommendation is for a fee bait that would, bring more cost parity between EVs and gas-powered cars. Essentially, a new fee would be placed on purchases of gas-powered cars, which would fund incentives to reduce electric vehicles. Makes sense. The plan also recommends direct-to-consumer sales by EV manufacturers, which was a bill that has been introduced in the legislature. Other recommendations of the plan to electrify transportation focus on expanding charging infrastructure, amending building codes to require new buildings to be EV charging ready, adopting utility rate designs to encourage off-peak charging, very important, and address onerous demand charges that currently exist. And have the state lead by example and shift to a zero emission state fleet. Legislation actually has just passed both houses in the state legislature that would do just that by 2035. That legislation awaits the governor's signature. In the area of public transportation, recommendations focus on making public transportation easier to use and to encourage the state to work with municipal transit systems on a schedule to electrify those systems. The plan is light on specifics about expanding public transportation systems generally in unserved and underserved areas, as well as how all of these things will be financed. Lastly, there is a suite of recommendations in the plan to encourage smart growth and transit-oriented development and support non-motorized alternatives. These are just a few examples. Incentives to businesses to encourage reduction in vehicle miles traveled by employees, reorienting state development assistance toward supporting transit-oriented development projects, and prioritizing state funding of local projects that support zero carbon transportation. So that's a broad brush overview. There are, of course, many specific recommendations in that 330-page plan. This slide highlights some recommendations that would be good to support in comments, but I'm not going to go through them now. We're going to share the slides with you, and we're also going to learn some more points to cover from our speakers, our next speakers today. I just want to emphasize again how important it is that you provide input into this process. Again, the public comment deadline is June 10th. This is the public's one big chance to weigh in on the plan and have an impact and make sure that we stay on target to meet our state's ambitious climate goals. And New Yorkers for Clean Power has developed an online public comment toolkit to make commenting easier for you. And the link is there. And again, we'll share these slides with you. And finally, just to wrap up, once the public comment period has ended, the Climate Action Council will review comments and revise the plan based on those comments, and then deliver the final version to the governor and the legislature by December 31st. And from there on out, it will be the basis of further legislation, regulations, and government action. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Betta and look forward to hearing from the rest of our speakers.
Thanks so much, Jen. That was great. And I don't know about you all, but I really appreciate having the Cliff Notes version of the draft scoping plan and the different sectors that Jen has diligently covered for us, transportation being the latest and an incredibly important one. So thank you again so much, Jen. So our next speaker is Fabio Montovany, who serves as Vice President of NYPA Ventures at the New York Power Authority, NYPA, and prior to his current role served as Vice President of e-mobility. So welcome, Fabio. Thank you so much for being here and looking forward to hearing the latest on what NYPA is doing on the charging front, your views on the scoping plan, and how quickly we can achieve our emission reduction targets in the transportation sector.
Absolutely. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, great. So first of all, Beta, Jen, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with this group. And a little bit about myself and about NYPA. So I spent 12 years so far in the renewable energy industry. I've been blessed to work in California, in Washington State, and now New York. So I've seen the best of the best when it comes to leading decarbonization for our economy, for our state. And I've been at NYPA for about 1.5 years, and I have to say, New York with this plan, with the scoping plan, I think is going to be probably even more ambitious than California in some areas. So I think it bodes really well for our economy. And I don't know if you guys saw in the scoping plan, right? It's not that we are just deploying money without a return. There is an NPV, net present value calculation. So every dollar that goes in, we expect to generate more value coming out. And that's very important, right? Because ultimately, there is a finite amount of money, and we want to use that money very carefully and thoughtfully. So my group at NYPA, among other things, we cover two very relevant areas for this conversation. So one is transit, obviously, but then there is also our solar and storage development. I'll just mention that, for example, we have supported the University of Albany in deploying the largest rooftop solar system in SUNY. And why is that important? Well, because certainly we're talking about transportation, but if you think about transportation, electrifying transportation, it's great, but if we don't also clean up our generation on the power plant sides and on the power supply side, well, we're still going to have a relatively relevant carbon footprint. So that's certainly an important area that we're looking at. Equity and inclusion is another very important element of our plan. So let me really briefly address some of the things that we are doing. So on the transit front, NYPA has two key components. One is Evolve New York. Evolve New York is a program where we are deploying DC fast charging to enable anybody to travel from Long Island to Canada to Buffalo without having to be worried about where I'm going to charge. And we are deploying infrastructure that is very high powered. So it's 150 kilowatts all the way to 350 kilowatts. And that means you can really charge your car in 20 minutes or less. A few other areas that we are covering within NYPA, and I'm going to try to stick to my timeline, which I think it was 3 minutes ago. So maybe I'm going to just go 2 minutes more here. But the other important area that I think Jen touched before is enabling public transit, electrifying public transit. And that's really ties into equity and inclusion. Right now, it does very little good to deploy a lot of infrastructure in some of the environmental justice and disadvantaged communities if there is no program to enable those communities to afford electric vehicles. That's critical. We need to do those things together. And I think part of it, is addressed in the draft scoping plan. But one thing that I would like to see in the draft scoping plan is a program to not only afford, not only rebate newer vehicles, but some program to get secondhand, right, pre-owned vehicles in the hands of those communities at a very competitive and low price. So that's one area that I would say maybe we should look a little bit more into the draft scoping plan. Like I said, our role is to fill the what we call the charging deserts, especially in upstate New York. And we have 100 DC fast chargers in the ground today. And our ambition is to have up to 800 by 2025. Now, why do I say up to 100? Well, because together with the private sector, we want to get there, right? So is the state plus the private sector having this joint target of 800 fast chargers. We also have an EV advocate group, and I would welcome anybody who's interested to join. We are having conversation, I believe, every quarter of the year, and we're really asking questions as, hey, do you have any ideas? Is there any area where you would like to see fast charging deployed? It's part of being advocate, engaging with the community and listening to the community, right, as we deploy our programs. Let me also mention something that, it's probably, I think it's interesting because so NYPA also has a subsidiary company called the Canal Corporation, and we are managing waterways. And some of the pilots that we're doing right now is, can we electrify some of the ferries, some of the boats? And again, it's not going to be a major contributor to GHG reduction, but I think is an important message to say it's not just about 4 wheels. There is 2 wheels, there is boats, there is potential also for aircrafts. And in fact, we're working with JFK right now to electrify in several terminals the ground support equipment. So when you guys board a plane, you smell the diesel, right? Sometimes of those machines that are operating on the ground. So we want to electrify all those components of the terminal, and just making sure that you guys will be surprised. Those are idling diesel machines. They're idling 24/7. So they have an amazing GHG reduction potential. So I think I've gone way too long. I'm going to try to stop here and then wait for questions, maybe more at the end. And feel free to reach out, guys. I'm going to put my email. I'm on LinkedIn. So happy to engage with the communities, especially in those EV advocacy forums that I mentioned earlier. Thank you so much.
Grazie, Fabio. That was great. Very interesting. I didn't know that about the electrifying boats and ferries too. And always glad to hear as an EV driver that there's going to be more fast charging stations in New York, because, well, we won't go into the gory details of what can happen when you are on the road and need to charge. And that's why people have range anxiety. So we need to get around that and get those charging stations built as quickly as possible. So thank you so much.
Can I just make it one? I forgot my last stunt, which is my friend from Austin Energy that gave me this shirt, which is electric is better than gas. So I wanted to share with you guys.
Love it.
Love that shirt.
Love it.
They're doing great things, those guys.
I want that shirt. Betta, can I just ask one thing? Fabio, is there a link or something you could put in the chat where people could sign up for the EV Advocates group?
Absolutely. Absolutely, that's the plan. So I'm going to give you guys our marketing manager email, and she's going to field all the inquiries, and she's going to add you to the mailing list.
Okay, great. And we can include that also in a follow-up email with the recording and everybody's slides. That does sound like a great resource, and I didn't know that group existed either. So maybe I'll join. So thank you, Fabio, for that, and thanks to those of you who are putting your questions in the chat, and we can also call on people live when we're finished. But we still have 2 speakers, so want to make sure we have time for everybody. Next up, we have Alok Disa, who is the Senior Research and Policy Analyst with Earthjustice and leads the Northeast Regional Office's transportation work. Alok and I have gotten to work together on the Electrify New York Coalition, which NYCP is a co-founder of over the last few years. And it's really terrific to have you here today, Alok, to share the great work that Electrify is doing in relation to the draft scoping plan.
And I want to just interject really quick, Alok, before you jump on, that it's been very helpful for the folks that are putting questions in. You've been very active in the chat, responding in real time. So much appreciate, a lot of appreciation for that. Respect.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for convening this really important gathering. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this really important subject alongside some really wonderful and accomplished speakers. As Betta said, my name is Alok Disa. I'm a senior research and policy analyst with Earthjustice in the Northeast Regional work, and I'm here. Let me share my screen. Right, I think that did it. Can folks see that? Are we good?
Great.
All right, cool. So I'm here to talk about the Electrify NY Coalition, our vision for a clean and equitable transportation future for New York, and how the state's climate plan can be strengthened to better position us to achieve the CLCPA's emission limits and equity provisions. And so first, I know we're a little bit off schedule a little bit, so I'll try to breeze through some of these slides a little quicker than I had anticipated, but I want to give you a little bit about the coalition. We're a statewide coalition of some local, state, and national groups that advocate for environmental justice, public transportation, social justice, and good jobs that are fighting for a clean, equitable, and electric transportation future for New York. A little bit about what we do and what we focus on in doing that work. We really focus on the dirtiest fleets and try to harness the power of public investment. Those are the two kind of pillars of the types of projects and campaigns that we work on. So that means prioritizing medium and heavy duty vehicle fleets like schools, school buses, and transit buses. The draft scoping plan includes, I have a snippet of it here, some good language that really emphasizes that diesel trucks and buses, while they're really only a small percentage of the vehicles on the road, they really are an outsized contributor, not just to the greenhouse gases from the transportation sector, but for the health harming emissions and co-pollutant emissions. So focusing on those, and often these fleets tend to traverse or they're located in or near environmental justice communities. So there's a public health and an environmental justice component to really electrifying the dirtiest medium and heavy duty vehicle fleets first. So that's kind of what our campaign focuses on. I'm going to kind of breeze through this slide, but there's study after study shows how harmful these types of emissions are from bus and truck fleets. Over 21 billion is estimated in overall health damages from transportation for 2016 alone, based on a recent study. And per vehicle, buses do the most damage. So electrifying those is really a big, important opportunity to mitigate that damage as a real public health intervention. So yeah, like I said, we focus on public spending. So fleets like school buses, transit buses, government fleets, where we can leverage public spending to promote projects that create good jobs and benefit local communities because there's public procurement processes and extra kinds of accountability for these types of projects. And so quickly, what does the draft scoping plan say about these medium and heavy duty vehicle fleets? For all the chart nerds out here, a little bit of a graph here, but basically the punchline of this graph is that the orange, which represents diesel, needs to get to zero as fast as possible, and the green and blue, which are the zero emission technologies, need to balloon as quickly as possible. To put it in quantitative terms, the plan says we need roughly 50% of our new sales of trucks and buses to be zero emissions by 2030. That means, and then also on top of that, 10% of the on-road vehicle population should be zero emission by 2030. So that means for trucks and buses, we have to get from a couple hundred now to closer to 20,000 by the end of this decade. So it's a pretty sizable task. And the draft scoping plan, as I have a quote here, underscores that early action and investment will be needed now to make sure that we set ourselves up to meet these goals and these mandates. So we can't really kick the can down the road. Even though 2050 might seem like a far ways off, we got to build that infrastructure now to set us up for success down the road. So yeah, what's in the plan? It has some good recommendations. We're really pleased with some of the recommendations relating to the transition to zero emission vehicles and equipment. The plan notes that it's central to achieving the state's goals, and that means getting off of gas and diesel and getting to zero emissions technology. It focuses on, it also calls for historic investments in public transportation, requirements for zero emissions equipment on certain types of fleets, and a focus on overburdened communities. So I think those are all really laudable and really important, and we're glad to see them in the draft plan, and we want to make sure that they continue to show up in the final plan, which is going to come out at the end of the year. But at the same time, the plan could be stronger in a few ways. I'm highlighting two of the concrete recommendations, or two of the specific recommendations in the draft plan that probably should be strengthened, that we would argue need to be strengthened. The first relates to fleet modernization and electrification of public transit fleets. I put a snippet of it here, but the upshot is that the draft plan only kind of says that the state should come up with a plan to transition. Doesn't say when, doesn't say how much money it's going to put towards that, doesn't say exactly how it's going to, do that. It's kind of abstract, vague. Same thing for strategy T3 about enhancing transit access to reduce VMT and increase, access to economic opportunity from enhanced public transit services. It just says that we need to increase utilization without saying what that means, how much we need to increase utilization, and how we're going to get it in terms of real, budgetary policy. So what do we want? We want a mandate to fully electrify public transit and paratransit across New York State and a significant expansion of transit service. So I'll highlight the main policy that we've been working on as a coalition. We were a little bit disappointed it didn't make it into the budget, the final budget negotiated by the governor and the legislature. It was in the Senate's proposed one-house budget, so we're hoping to get it across the finish line this year, and really eager to get that done. We call it the Green Transit, Green Jobs legislation. You see the bill number there. The bottom line for this one is it does have that mandate. It requires all new transit agency purchases, including vehicles and equipment, to be zero emissions by 2029, and it only would have them phase in as part of the normal replacement of vehicles. So it doesn't mean you have to get rid of all your fleets in 2029, all your vehicles in 2029. As you upgrade and replace your vehicles, the new purchases should be zero emissions. It covers transit buses and paratransit vehicles, which is really important because folks who ride paratransit tend to be on those vehicles for a longer time. And so it's a really important equity issue. It implements best value procurement to promote good jobs and family sustaining wages, to give kind of a nudge for those types of projects. Creates workforce development reports so we can really understand what the impacts are going to be on existing workers and identify ways to retrain them and give them the skills that they need to benefit from this transition. And it also tells agencies to start planning now to think about how you're going to meet that mandate, so we're not caught off guard. It supports transit agencies by offering technical assistance, and it does allow for some limited exemptions in sort of extreme circumstances. So that's kind of the main policy. We think that should be part of the final scoping plan, a mandate, date certain to get off of diesel buses. We also think that the final plan needs to be improved upon in that recommendation about expanding transit access. The Transportation Advisory Panel actually included a very concrete target to double transit accessibility and availability for upstate and downstate suburban communities. Here you have the snippet of it from their recommendations to the Climate Action Council. For some reason, that was taken out of the draft plan. It was not included in the draft plan. And so we are asking that the Climate Action Council go back and include this very specific metric for expanding transit access and availability into the final scoping plan. Finally, I won't get into all the details here, but we also need funding for it. The plan calls for historic levels of investment, but what does that mean? We need something a little bit more specific to help guide policymakers and lawmakers to figure out that we're on track, and something for the public to kind of measure success against. In the school bus electrification fight that Jen mentioned at the top, that Electrify NY was really kind of leading on in a lot of ways with a lot of other advocates, but we were championing that issue as well. We were asking for $300 million per year in the near term to make sure that the mandate to transition to electric school buses does not burden school districts that have a million other competing priorities about educating their students, and they're not experts on electrification. So without that funding, it would have felt burdensome. So we were excited that there's $500 million proposed in the Environmental Bond Act, which is pending voter approval. We need something similar. What are we going to give public transit agencies so that they can double this access and electrify their fleets, but without feeling like they have to cut corners, compromise on other aspects, and really make it feel like a burden for them? We don't want it to be a burden for them. We think it's a real opportunity. Couple other things that I'd love to be able to highlight. Maybe we can get to it in the Q&A, but I will stop there. Thanks so much for the time and the opportunity to talk about these issues with you. You can follow our coalition on Twitter, and you can email me at adisa@earthjustice.org. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alok. That was very comprehensive of all the great work that Electrify New York is doing to advance clean transportation, and a lot of different ways for people to plug in, so to speak, and get involved both with the scoping plan comments on the legislative front and supporting the upcoming vote on the Environmental Bond Act this fall, which fingers crossed, we'll get over the finish line and fund some really important decarbonization initiatives.
And I'll just say real quickly, anything that we don't get to in the Q&A, we're going to follow up in a Google Doc when we send the recordings. So just giving a heads up for everybody here. We're going to do our due diligence to make sure we get responses to everything.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ibrahim. That is one thing we always try to do, is get people's questions answered and send those question and answers around after for everybody to learn more. Because we're a learning community and that's why we're gathering, but we also want to respect people's times, and this might be your lunch break. So we've got to get it all in. And last but not least, our last speaker, Juan Restrepo, the senior organizer for Transportation Alternatives, which is a grassroots transportation advocacy nonprofit based in New York City. And great to have Juan because we know it's not just about electrification with making transportation clean, although electrify everything is my mantra, but we know it's also incredibly important to have policies that support bike-friendly, pedestrian-friendly communities, and of course, public transit. So thanks, Juan, for being here.
And for folks who aren't familiar with TA, they're literally the most feared and respected grassroots, one of the most feared and respected grassroots organizations in New York City. People in policy circles always sit up when they know that TA is in the mix. So sorry, Juan, I just want to give that that shout out.
Thank you, Ibrahim. It kind of, I don't know, I feel like I have to live up to that now, which is a little daunting, but I'll try my best. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Juan Restrepo. I'm the senior organizer at Transportation Alternatives. That means that I manage a team of about 7 organizers throughout New York City who sort of take on each borough and organize hyperlocal grassroots campaigns to promote pedestrian, bike, and mass transit friendly engineering changes and policies. We work with a pretty wide network of New York City residents, and we empower them to actively engage with their elected officials. And I think to what Ibrahim was saying before, like when you bring in that grassroots element, you basically can tell people like we have voters on our side. It says a lot about what your policy is going to do. So I have a little presentation as well. I'm going to share it right now. And could someone just let me know if we can see this right now? Just thumbs up or yes.
We can see it.
Thank you. So today I just want to go over, I feel like a lot of what I've said has been said before, but maybe I can add like a perspective or a way that we see this work and how we're going to submit our comments. And maybe that's a helpful reminder to people, like we all have to submit our comments for the scoping plan. So we're in that camp as well. So if you haven't yet, let's do it. Number one, I think one of the things that I really want to highlight about the scoping plan is the idea of reducing vehicle miles traveled and increasing public transit. This speaks directly to our mission as an organization. Our goal is to promote other options transportation-wise in New York City from a variety of different angles. Typically, our strongest angle that we're using is that having a very car-dependent city results in many traffic fatalities. And we have a sister organization called Families for Safe Streets, who's composed of family members who've lost loved ones in traffic violence. But there's a very strong component where you can also make the case that building a less car-dependent city increases health outcomes and increases sustainability. I think we're all getting far too familiar with the names of hurricanes that are coming through our city. And it feels like more and more each year, more elected officials are sort of seeing the connection between transportation and producing a sustainable city. So we're trying to lean into that with the climate action scoping process. I would also highlight two interesting statistics, which is that when we produce, a city that requires less car dependency, we can also increase health outcomes. So I have two little bullet points that show that there's always a pocketbook angle, which I think speaks to a lot of legislators. Increasing the health benefits of how you get around results in billions of dollars back. Same thing with increasing air quality, and some of the suggestions that we have tackle these issues. So this is kind of the lens that we're going to look at for 6 suggestions. We have plenty more that we're going to be including, but I just want to highlight some of the ones that we're going to be talking about during our comments. We want to immediately transition from a car-centric infrastructure model to one that promotes sustainable methods of transportation, which seems a little bit antithetical to maybe some of the electrification conversation, but I think they work hand in hand. There's a role for cars and trucks and buses in our cities. We think that it has an outsized role as of right now, and that we can develop a city that requires them less, and ideally the ones that still exist afterwards are electrified. And there's also a social justice aspect to thinking about how we create sustainable modes of transportation. I think I don't need to maybe explain like the power broker and the effect Robert Moses had on many different communities in New York City. So I'm just going to kind of go through the list because I only have 10 minutes, but here's 6 some of the talking points that we're going to be bringing up. And most of them are sort of kind of hinged on our main priority as an organization, which is a new project called 25 by 25. Our goal is to convert 25% of New York City road space by 2025. It has the support of Mayor Adams and lots of other important city officials. And the main phrasing we like to use is that asphalt can be an asset. Our roads are publicly owned for the most part. What we do with them and how we prioritize them is a question of policy and is a question of power, quite frankly. So when we think about our streets, we can really think about how we're going to frame them for the future. And they're some of the easiest spaces to work with because they're literally all owned by the government, who's beholden to the people. So number 1, I think this is pretty obvious, let's invest in sponge city infrastructure. We've been seeing more pilots for permeable or porous pavement. We've also been seeing that bioswales can be an effective tool for fighting climate change. What we do need to also see involved in reducing more of this is the funding necessary. Many of these things have maintenance costs associated with them. Even porous pavement needs to maintain its porosity. Bioswales can be filled with trash. So there needs to be proper funding for city agencies to allow these to both be built, but then to be maintained. We need to think about designating tree cover priority districts. The allocation of trees in New York City is oftentimes inequitable, where you have certain communities that have beautiful tree-lined streets and others that don't. And this results in a heat island effect that often can be detrimental to people's health. There needs to be a more equitable distribution of trees. How they get planted is a political process, and we want to, again, sort of raise up the idea that reclaiming road space can be used as part of the process of planting more trees in our communities. We need to expand bus lanes and busways, especially in areas of the city that are least served by subways. One way that we've successfully seen this done is a few busways were recently installed in the eastern portions of Queens, right around the area where the MTA service ends. There are many people who are dependent on bus service, and oftentimes they have some of the longest commutes in the city. So prioritizing streets in a way that results in them not needing to one day purchase a car is a very sustainable minded goal that we can achieve pretty easily because this is part of the toolkit that we've been using. If you look at the photo that I've included on this slide, this is part of the New York City Streets Plan, and it includes possible locations for busways and bus lanes. At this point, you know, the city just made an investment of $900 million to promote this plan. Mayor Adams recently put it into the pot, and our goal at this point is to sort of create the opportunity for electeds to see, like, we need to create these plans because there is a political calculus when it comes to creating any infrastructure that isn't sort of the maintenance of roads and parking for cars. Improving substandard bike and pedestrian access, especially on our bridges. These are often crucial crossing points for people who need to get from borough to borough, and we're a 5-borough city. If a bridge is a limiting factor for you, a lot of people end up buying cars and sort of not using the preferred mode of transport because they literally cannot go from a place they need to go to a place they need to go. We've easily seen that the city can implement dedicated biking infrastructure on the Brooklyn Bridge by just reclaiming a lane from cars, turning it into a lane for sustainable minded transportation. All that's required is sort of that internal will, and we have plenty of other bridges that can use that support as we're constantly seeing the numbers of people using alternative forms of transportation to get around increasing. Implementing a ideally city-funded bike share program. As of right now, City Bike is privately funded, and that has hampered their ability to build out a full 5-borough model of City Bike access. And there are plenty of areas that are transit deserts that could benefit with having bike share available because the vast majority of car trips are actually 2 miles or less. So building out a network of vehicles that people can easily acquire that will get them where they need to go will help to reduce the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled. A secondary consideration here is creating a network of safe bike parking, which is often one of the top 3 reasons why people don't bike. The other 2 being safe bike infrastructure, or something else. There are private companies like Unipod that have been proposing both large bike parking hubs that can be placed near transit hubs and mini bike parking hubs, as you can see in the photo below, that can take the place of a parking space, but can increase the amount of people being serviced by 10-fold, because one of these hubs can park 10 individual bikes versus a parking space which can only host enough space for one person's vehicle. And an important consideration, especially as we bring it back to Robert Moses, capping the Cross Bronx Expressway, really rethinking what are the substantial barriers that keep people from accessing their neighborhood and their community the way that they want to. Oftentimes highways are deterrents for people to access their communities, and they act as barriers. So this is something that's been proposed by Senator Schumer and Congressmember Richard Torres. There are plenty of other considerations for projects like these, and when we do cap these spaces, we can build dense public housing, we can build parks. There's, asphalt is an asset, and what we do with it is up in the air, but we can build out a lot of the goals that we're trying to achieve through the climate action plan through using this space more as more than just a space for cars, ideally. Those are some ideas. We have some more that we have for sure, and you're always welcome to contact us if you want to discuss more of our perspective on how to use road. With that, can I pass it back to you, Bella?
Great. Thank you so much, Juan. That was great. Very informative. and perfect timing because it's 12:59. So if people need to jump for their 1 o'clock, they can. But do want to open it up for questions, and we've been having a great chat back and forth, which we'll capture some of those great links and ideas and share with folks. But you know, if anybody does want to raise their hand and ask a question, I think we can stay on for a few more minutes, and you know, we always want to make this as interactive as possible. So does anybody want to ask a question? Jacqueline, I see.
Hi, thank you. So can you give us advice on what we can do to turn the scoping plans initiatives into actual mandates and funding? Where we apply pressure and how?
Great question.
Thanks for joining us, Alok. Keep going.
I mean, I would just start by saying that, you know, it is a plan, and the more specific it is, and you've heard a bunch of like very specific recommendations today, the more specific it is, and inclusive it is of the things we need to do, the more likely it will be in legislation and reflected in legislation and regulation and the like. But I have heard a lot of legislators say this year, well, we're going to wait and see what's in the scoping plan. So that could be just putting it off, but it also suggests that it's really important, and specificity is key. Like these vague things are not helpful.
Look, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly, but unfortunately I have to run to a meeting, but I think it's a great question. And actually, so while the plan is not exactly itself directly enforceable, the state is required to adopt regulations that are going to be, you know, law of the land, you know, enforceable regulations. And those regulations have to be sort of, I forget what the exact word is in the CLCPA, but have to be largely based on the scoping plan. So to Jen's point again, like the better we can get the scoping plan, the better arguments we'll have when those regulations have to come out that, hey, the regulations said X, Y, and Z thing, and you didn't address that at all. That runs afoul of what the CLCPA was saying. So, yeah.
And couldn't there be some specificity to the administrative rulings so that you're covering both legislation and like agency directives, so that, right, this could be a push to say this agency should be doing X, Y, or Z, or using these markers.
Yeah.
So you
100%. There's plenty of things that we could do without legislation in here, and there's some things that we will need legislation for. And the stuff that the government agencies can do right now, you know, we'd like to see them move on without even waiting for those further regulations to come out.
That's right.
Yeah, Ibrahim, you had an excellent point. I think there is a cadence when, for example, just before the State of the State address, right, 3 months, maybe 4 months leading into that, well, the conversation happened, right? What are we going to put in the State of the State address that then eventually is going to become legislation? And I think that is a good touch point, right, for communities like this to kind of get together, gather ideas, and just making sure that some of this idea, they actually eventually make it into the State of the State. So, yeah, absolutely.
Put pressure.
Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Thank you for your answers and for a fabulous set of presentations today.
Oh, thank you so much for being here and for your great question. We appreciate it. And we know, you know, regardless of how ambitious the plan ends up being, hopefully as ambitious as possible, and we all need to submit comments to that effect, but we're going to have to keep pushing for better legislation, for regulation. You know, it's even if we have this great plan, we know that there's still going to be a lot of work that we have to do to implement it. Okay, so should we stay on for a few more minutes and see if we can answer a couple more questions? People are okay with that? So we had, Georgie has a question about, does anyone know about U.S. efforts to convert gas vehicles on a wider scale? That's actually something I think would be fantastic to include in the scoping plan, is how can we encourage, like my mechanic friend down the road who wants to start a business to convert old, you know, Volvos and Audis to electric? And how can we support those kinds of entrepreneurial efforts? Does
Maybe
anybody?
let me add something that so I'm here at Distribute Tech is a conference here in Dallas, and just yesterday I had a conversation with some manufacturer that they claim they're going to be able to turn over a Ford Transit van from gas to electric with batteries in 1 day. That is amazing. If they're effectively able to do that, right? That's transformational, especially right now that we have a lot of supply chain issues, right? To get those electric vehicles.
That is really exciting and interesting. And have you heard of that being at all talked about in New York State policy circles to encourage that type of conversion? I know one of our concerns, right, is I think actually I heard that the most there's a lot of talk of job losses in the, you know, clean energy transition. And I think I read that the biggest job loss they're projecting is actually gas station workers. But also, of course, there's mechanics, and that's part of the Green Jobs, Green Transit bill as well, right? Is how can we make sure that it is a just transition and that workers, you know, in industries that are reliant on fossil fuels have new opportunities. So something else to support in our comments. Okay, any other questions that speakers want to grab, or anybody want to raise their hands and we can call on you?
Could I just, while you're looking at those, or if people are thinking, I just want to, you know, emphasize a point I think Fabio made about, you know, a lot of the focus has been on sales of new cars. And, you know, in presentations I've given in the past, people are like, who buys a new car? You know, people can't afford to buy new cars. And so focusing on that, you know, on used cars on that market as well, and incentivizing that, you know, is going to be really important.
Yes, absolutely. I love that point. And I thought there was some legislation that was being introduced that would provide a rebate for used EVs. But yeah, that is critical and something we should stay on. One piece of legislation I don't know if anyone talked about, but is something that New Yorkers for Clean Power has been supporting now for a few years. Wish it wasn't a few years, but is the direct EV sales bill, which would enable an EV manufacturer like Tesla to open more than just 5 stores. People might be surprised to learn that, you know, while we have auto dealerships everywhere, if you're an EV manufacturer in New York State, you're limited to only 5 locations where you can sell EVs, which is kind of crazy. And we see like people in Florida, where there's way more, you know, Tesla dealerships, showrooms, you have like tons more EVs on the road. So I think, you know, there is that direct correlation between the availability of EVs, people being able to walk into a showroom, test drive a EV, and then realize, oh, wait, this is really fun. I should make my, you know, my next car electric if you can afford it. And there are increasingly much more affordable makes and models. So just another piece of legislation that will help get more people on the road behind EVs. Okay, and I know people are dropping off, but thank you so much for being here, Fabio, and I see Catherine raising an important question about marketing public transit. Jen, or I don't know if you want to take that one.
Is the comment that there is not sufficient marketing of public transit? Is that, and you can, I think you could ask your question directly. Yeah, you know, I mean, that is definitely something to speak to. And, you know, there's a focus on trying to increase like ease of access to public transportation in the scoping plan, and, you know, like apps that will make it easier for you to connect different forms of public transportation and that kind of thing. But yes, marketing is huge, and it's not just transportation. Like this is hugely important kind of missing piece in the scoping plan, or it doesn't get enough attention. There needs to be a serious, well-funded and like starting yesterday, public education and information campaign around climate, but also around the climate solution. It's in building electrification. It's in all of these solutions. And there's a lot of misinformation that's being put out about these solutions and these technologies. So this is like a critical piece. People have to understand what the options are and that they're viable and be thinking about them to make the right choices now.
Absolutely. We need that public campaign, marketing campaign, so that everybody knows about the Climate Act and the climate plan and the solutions and how we can all participate and build this movement and transition as quickly as possible for our planet, for healthier communities, for green jobs. There's so many reasons, but as Jen said, many people aren't aware that this is happening. So maybe that's something else we can put in our comments. Okay, well, we should probably wrap up because we're 10 minutes over, but thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to our speakers. Jen, I don't know if there's any, and I should say thank you, Bryn and Melissa, our NYCP teammates who are holding down the back end and of course, always helping to promote on socials and in our blasts. Hope, you'll all stay connected with us as we go forward and share this recording and slides and Jen's excellent guide that we have on our website, with your networks. And Jen, I don't know if there's anything more to say to encourage people to submit comments in the next couple of weeks, but.
Yeah, no, I just, please do. And as you heard, we had such great speakers today. We'll be sharing all of their slides. They have really great, recommendations of points to cover that weren't in like my overview presentation. So there's like great materials here and I encourage you to run with it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.